Elvis Costello, considered one of the greatest songwriters of all time, with multiple decades of acclaimed, eclectic records under his belt. And for the majority of the first two of those decades, he recorded and toured those records with the same backing band, The Attractions, an absurdly talented trio in their own right. Keyboardist Steve Naive, bassist Bruce Thomas, and drummer Pete Thomas are themselves considered one of the greatest backing bands of all time. They more than proved their worth on their first three stellar and commercially successful albums with Elvis. But was that enough for them to take a stab at their own record without him? Today, I want to discuss and review The Attractions' sole album without Elvis Costello, Mad About the Wrong Boy. And maybe we'll see why they never tried again. Previously, I reviewed and ranked Elvis's studio albums up through 2022's A Boy Named If. At the end, I briefly touched on Mad About the Wrong Boy, and considered following that video up by giving this album its own thorough review. And I got so intrigued by the idea, here we are. And part of that intrigue is the simple question of why? Why would an honestly mercenary backing band, initially hired piecemeal to tour Elvis's first album, record one of their own without him? Well, first off, backing bands going solo, if you will, was not a weird idea at all, especially in their native UK. Cliff Richard's backing band The Shadows were UK hitmakers with and without Cliff for decades. The Rumour, who were the backing band for fellow UK pub rock veteran Graham Snisser, put out their own records in the years before this one. But most relevant to The Attractions, one of Costello's very favorite bands was The Band, a beloved country rock and folk group whose careers took off after touring as the backing band for Bob Dylan. So there was more than enough precedent for this. As for why they would go for it, George Purvis speculates in his book about Elvis and the Attractions that keyboardist Steve Naive played a part in it. Steve gathered a significant backlog of songs around this time, many of them co-written with his then partner, Faye Hart, aka Farrah Fuck It Minor. Purvis suspects that Steve was frustrated that Elvis didn't want to record any of his songs. They played a few in a handful of live shows in the years before this, and that was it. And considering Steve wrote the vast majority of the album with and without Faye, and later went on to release the only solo albums out of The Attractions, the idea certainly holds some water. Biographer Mick St. Michael also suspects that the aftermath of their third album with Elvis and his fourth overall, Get Happy, played a part in its creation. They made Get Happy after a grueling tour, during which Elvis made the stupidest decision of his career that still haunts him to this day. I talk about it more in the Armed Forces section of the last video. But after all of that, and then the subsequent album fueled by alcohol and anger, and its own rough supporting tour, Elvis decided he had enough and quit the band. He soon changed his mind after Steve was injured in a car crash, but St. Michael suspects that Elvis quitting raised the question of what the Attractions could do without him. Combined with their increase in free time, which the band members spent with their families or doing session work, recording their own album made some kind of sense to someone. Biographer Brian Hinton also points out that F-Beat Records won managerial control of Elvis from its head label, Later Records, just before Get Happy came out. F-Beat was co-headed by Elvis's manager at the time, Jake Riviera. It suggests F-Beat greenlit this album to take advantage of calling their own business shots. The problem with confirming any of this is just nobody who worked on this album except Bruce Thomas ever spoke about it again. That's left even basic details up in the air like, who worked on this album? We know all three Attractions wrote and performed the songs, and that their then engineer Roger Bashirian both engineered and produced. But the writing credits were fuzzy. The songs Steve co-wrote with Faye Hart were credited under pseudonym Brain and Heart, and only confirmed after the fact to be them, and you can just check ASCAP if you're not convinced. Both Bruce and Pete Thomas were credited together for their songs, but the later 90s CD reissue took away Pete's credit on the first three, bringing into question if he did co-write them, or if Bruce was initially forced to share the credit for all of his songs. The vinyl version specifies that each credited songwriter wrote the words and music, so maybe Bruce alone handled the lyrics, but he and Pete wrote the music together, and the credit was changed later to clarify the lyricists? That is pure speculation, though, because of the lack of concrete information. The Attractions were collectively credited for vocals and guitars, but no individual specifics. Only by comparing with Steve's later solo album, Moo Moo, can he confirm that he sang his songs. And Bruce later confirmed that he sang all of his and Pete's songs. Guitar was also usually Elvis's instrument, and Pete Thomas is also a guitarist. He later played acoustic on the 1996 recording of You Bowed Down, for example. Bruce, as bass guitarist, could also logically fill that role, and critic Ira Kaplan even questioned if Elvis himself recorded them. However, Bruce later confirmed that all lead guitars were performed by his former Quiver bandmate Tim Renwick, who was otherwise never credited anywhere. George Purvis knew this in his book, and I wondered where the hell he got that information. Probably from Bruce, who only confirmed it in the comments of his personal blog on New Year's Eve 2012. And you can only see them in the Internet Archive now. In the many years since this album released, most obscure details were only ever confirmed by Bruce, who no longer works with Elvis, in part because of their years of bad blood. And he seems to have never had any positive memories or opinions of this album at the time or since, except one song, so he is almost certainly a biased account. But since he is the only one involved in its creation who ever spoke on it in detail, the only first-hand accounts we have are his, and whatever information the label printed on the records. Records, by the way, that they never released in the US. These are imports. In the modern internet age, that shouldn't be an issue for finding information anymore, and yet researching this album was nothing but breadcrumb trails, conflicting details, and flimsy speculation. All of this smacks of an album without a lot of faith behind it. But that leaves us with just the album itself, and it's only the second Attractions album out of several that they recorded under difficult circumstances. But some of those, including its immediate predecessor, turned out excellent. So let's dive into the music as it is and see what they pull together. For the sake of understanding public reaction, let's start with the first of the album's two singles, the advanced track Single Girl. And we're already off to a concerning start. It's a treacly bubblegum pop tune, the UK's version of Bubblegum Mind, which was somehow even less gritty than America's. In some ways, it does predict the lush pop albums to follow with Elvis. Steve's piano has the floor and it glistens. But the band have none of Elvis's ear for melodies, harmonies, or arrangements. The title line combined with some awful scattershot lyrics make the whole thing feel like self-mockery.
Spick and spotty, a little naughty, walkie-talkie girl. Go humdrum on some real humdinger, just flex my ivory fingers and here comes another single. Here comes another single.
Here comes another single. Not his intention, I'm sure. Maybe that's unfair. But making this clumsy piece of empty glitter the lead single by one of rock's best backing bands for their own album makes for a sad first impression. And this is all in a song that I still kind of like. You can hear how this could come together. Steve isn't a strong vocalist, not much presence or charisma, doesn't stay on key that well, but another singer joins him on the bridge, I assume co-writer Faye Hart, again nobody was credited, and their voices complement each other. They even put some power into that bridge and the final verse, and it feels like a glimpse at the version of the song that deserved to be a single. So that's my first impression of the Attractions solo. I'm not convinced yet, but I can hear where I could be. So let's get into the album proper, which just so happens to open with its second single, Arms Race, and it's a much better first impression. The first sound on the album is Pete's drums reversed and distorted into a wall of noise before his martial rhythm breaks through and kicks off the song. It's such a good opener because it displays everyone's talents independent of Elvis. Pete's vice-tight drum rhythm, Bruce's melodic and dexterous bass, Steve's command of keyboard textures and atmosphere, and even Roger Bashirian's elevation of their talents with a clear mix and some smart studio trickery. All of that makes you ignore the sexual blunt force trauma of the lyrics. Unfortunately, this song also displays that Steve, writing solo this time, does not have Elvis's knack for clever wordplay or cutting social observation. He just kind of inelegantly throws every lyrical idea at the wall, but credit to him for going for it. This and even Single Girl, they're clumsy, but I'd rather he be bold and just miss every shot than be painfully safe and boring. Spoiler alert, I say it's a strong opener, and they even did it entirely without guitars. they don't pull that off again.
I've seen those battery operated, all kinds of fornicating, formulating, pulsing ways, salting without warning. Warning up to date lovers come tomorrow, handcuffed couples you can cuddle in the rubble, but before you're in trouble, it's an arms race.
Steve brings a bit more snot with Damage. It's simpler lyrically than Elvis's songwriting, but it draws on a very Costello concept of a miserable, codependent relationship. Steve's narrator is happy to put up with abuse because he'd rather that than loneliness. Steve's organ takes lead, once again avoiding guitars, and I do think it's the first track that feels like it's missing a piece because of it. It needs some more body, some more solid rhythm under the melody. The synth pulse alongside Pete's snare does not do the same job, making it also the first time on the album that Bashirian's production gets in the way of the band rather than elevates them. I can only describe Steve's vocals as floppy. He does have a youthful, flick-of-the-nose looseness that works on the faster, louder tracks like this. I've compared his voice to T.V. Smith or Howard Devoto, but the more loose-lipped approach and inability to stay on key also reminds me of Richard Hell. He's still not on any of their levels, though, because he just lacks their conviction. Richard Hell is a wailing maniac in front of a much sharper band, and Steve and the Attractions, as skilled as they are, just don't cut loose. He has the snot, but not the spit. Not a bad song, but we quickly hear the band's weaknesses again when they manage to avoid them in the opener.
Laughing at you, 'cause the things you do, it's a good turn, baby, it's a good turn. I would rather hurt than go home, go lonely, and go damage me, damage me, damage me, damage me on my own.
Little Misunderstanding was, again, initially credited to both Bruce and Pete Thomas, but later revised to just Bruce. And after a decent opening pair, it's a big stumble for the album. Yet more treacly bubblegum melodies, lyrics, and ideas, but woefully underwritten, way worse than Single Girl. It relies on vocal delays and vocoders, and its singular title pun that they do nothing with to make it interesting. The Achilles heel is that Bruce, who sings all of the Thomas's songs, is not a compelling voice or presence either. He sings later songs better, but he puts nothing into this one. He sounds as uninterested as he claims he was in the years after. The thing is, his vocal timbre and the playful bounce of the music isn't a million miles away from madness.
Little Misunderstanding. Good morning, miss. Can I help you, son?
Just me? Maybe it's because they both say miss. My point is, if the song just had some zip, and especially if Bruce had even an ounce of Suggs' charisma, it could maybe work, but Bruce doesn't hide how little he wants to be here. I like his bass work here, he's still a great talent there. But it's overall a half-hearted attempt at chipperness without any real hooks. Early contender for the worst song on the album, and it's only track 3.
Who loves you? Who says so?
In a massive turn from that, Straight Jacket is one of the tracks that almost reaches Elvis and the Attractions' sound. Another snotty song from Steve, this time about the default, conformist expectations of adulthood just being a prison. He gets in some good shots, but he loses it by the end, and the band's lack of sense for harmonies and melodies have already caught up to them. That said, like I hinted in the last video, there is some resonance with queer experiences here that I'm sure Steve didn't intend. But just if you twist what the title means, cis-heteronormativity, compulsory heterosexuality, just the desire for a free life of one's own.
Factory fathers and assembly line ladies pushing prams and building babies. Straight jacket, straight jacket. All day long you're pointing at me, making sure I look like daddy. Straight jacket, straight jacket.
Don't misunderstand me. This is not a Good Luck Babe, a song that made me sob in grief and regret. I was stressed out that day. But I think a queer artist could make a powerful, context-changing cover if they ever wanted to. There's more here than just a stuck-up mockery of conformity, even if by accident.
Don't let on, 'cause once you've decided, once you put your foot inside it, and all the strings are on the outside. Straight jacket, straight jacket, straight jacket, hey, straight jacket.
Stephen Fay wrote the title track, a biting rant at a girl in her countless failed romances. The guys were accused of the same misogyny leveled at Elvis since his debut, and I can see this being one of the tracks that inspired that take. Even with Fay co-writing, it's hard to tell if the song is on the girl's side or if it's mocking her. Elvis, even when singing about demonstrable misogynists, makes it clear that those guys suck, but this song browbeats the girl alone too much to make that clear. It's also another track that highlights the album's thin, sleek production, which robs it of any energy the band can put into it. There are guitars here as a textural element, but Steve's synth doesn't fill enough space to make up for their absence in the rhythm section.
You wouldn't put the toys away till they gotten in the way, and the line broken on the playroom floor. Your tiny tears start down your face, cross your heart, hope to die if you try, but somehow you can't stop. Mad about the wrong boy, mad about the wrong boy. You've been playing with the wrong toy.
Bruce's Motorworld opens with a bizarre collection of spoken lines over plodding, empty music that sounds like a deleted Young Ones sketch.
Here comes the bright spot.
But when the song proper kicks in, it has some decent early new wave, even rockabilly energy with Steve's staccato piano stabs. Bruce has none of that energy in his singing and doesn't try to stay on key, which makes his double-tracked vocals dissonant sometimes, and his lyrics are about as confident. But it shows how you can make up for a lot with that zip that Little Misunderstanding lacked. Again, could use a rhythm guitarist to fill out the mix though. Motorworld transitions straight into Stephen Fay's next track, On the Third Stroke, one of the album's better cuts. It's the same anti-romantic, anti-conformist marriage moping as much of the album, with lolling, languid verses, but more than most tracks, it has a snappy, catchy sense of lyrical rhythm in the choruses, combined with a funky groove and a solid guitar solo by Tim Renwick. Presumably, it's one of the tracks that makes me think the band did know what they were doing. They just needed more help cultivating their potential than they had.
Counterclockwise conversation, cute alarm calls, rings on fingers, chit chat on the phone. All of us set the timer on the other. There isn't much time, and I feel like I'm going away.
Side 1 closes on a surprise. The first of 2 Thomas tracks that I would consider this album's genuine hidden gems. Yes, Bruce Thomas, the guy who had no confidence in this album and put all of that into his vocals, wrote a genuinely cool centerpiece for it and possibly the better B-side to Single Girl. Slow Patience is a fittingly titled slower song, again heavy on Steve's organ, but with such a cool, gloomy, ominous atmosphere that actually suits Bruce's weaker, monotone voice.
All at sea and down at the ocean. She moves so slow, the water turns to sand.
It fits the song's ponderous, lonely longing. Bruce compares waiting to see his lover again to her being lost in a jungle or across the ocean. Again, not the sharpest or cleverest lyrics.
The way is all uphill, she's so inclined.
That line got roasted to hell and back. But for the first time, the Attractions made their own song without Elvis that sounds completely unlike him and succeeds on its own terms. And if that wasn't enough, the second hidden gem comes right after. Side 2 opens with La 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 Loved You. Still can't believe that's a real title. The first of the 2 songs still credited to both Bruce and Pete after the reissue, and it's an actual good 60s tinged pop song. The lyrics are simple again, maybe even pedestrian, could have written them over lunch, but in a way that works for a pop song. A douchebag loves and leaves a girl and ends up the heartbroken one because of the good thing he ruined. Bruce sounds halfway into it, and though the trumpets are corny in a way that just highlights the thinness of the album's production, it sounds complete and invigorated. Tim Renwick, allegedly, even provides a solid guitar solo to bring it home, showing how they could have used him on more of the album. Bruce and/or Pete went from contender for the worst track on the album to contender for the best. Not an instant classic by any means, but another sign that the Attractions had more potential than they got credit for.
But when we met in the street, my heart skipped a beat. Your friend said you dumped me with through. So now I've been round the world and I had loads of girls, but I'll never stop dreaming of you. Dreaming of you.
The next track on the album is Single Girl, which we've already discussed, but its placement here in the album is funny after what would have frankly been the much better pop single. Loved You sounds halfway sincere, but Single Girl sounds like the wrong kind of sarcasm in a too slick package. Again, I do like the song, but it's not to these guys' strengths. Lonesome Little Town is the last of the Thomases songs, both Bruce and Pete, and the second of the B-sides, and it's another positive surprise from them. It's built on top of a cod reggae beat with some nice sharp guitars and breezy synth textures that gives them the bounce they need to prop up Bruce's weak vocals, though he puts more effort into it than most of his tracks. He almost reminds me of Mark E. Smith at points, and he and Pete even lyrically clue into that rotting conservatism that made Armed Forces so cutting. It's strange that the guy who discounts this album so much clearly had more potential than he and anyone else thought. Steve's keyboards almost drown out the last verse, but I'm okay with it because it makes the song crescendo before it closes out on a bizarre, wobbling coda. It's a funny choice, but I come out of it liking the song without any real caveats. Steve and Faye get unhinged in Taste of Poison, and frankly, thank fuck for that. This album needs some teeth, even if it's in a way that borders on comical compared to the shiny pop chips right before it. They take on some J.G. Ballard's Crash imagery, turning horrible vehicular death into something lurid and lustful. The song starts with a similar ominous, synth-led atmosphere as Slow Patience, but constantly building and intense, until Pete comes in and kicks the song right off the road. It's no Warm Leatherette or Underpass, much better Ballardian songs of the era, but its constant crescendo gives the album its last real kick of life before its slower ending stretch. Between this and Slow Patience, maybe the Solo Attractions missed their calling as a goth-adjacent synth band. Then again, before they recorded this album, someone did die in Steve's car crash that year. That sours the song pretty bad for me. I hope they didn't write it about that. We're back on solid ground with Highrise Housewife. Domestic disappointment is a classic Costello subject, and Steve and Faye make some cutting commentary here. The music is languid, but like Bruce's Slow Patience, it works with Steve's weaker voice and sells the housewife's gloomy, loveless life. Steve's glistening piano also brings that same elegant domestic facade that Trust and Imperial Bedroom later would. And echoing the keys, combined with panning Steve's vocals far left, makes it feel like one of Richard Wright's great early Pink Floyd songs like Paintbox or Remember a Day. I can see this song being another reason critics accuse the band of misogyny, but you'd have to make a bad faith reading of what's really direct, mirror-to-society satire. The song sounds like it's on the housewife's side, by questioning why anyone would want such a loveless, stereotypical married life.
She laid the table, swept the broom off its feet, turned on a radio once again. He's late, so why be nice and make the bed when you can use the couch tonight instead? Highrise housewife, you're out of your mind.
So even with Single Girl in there, I think that was a comparatively strong stretch of tracks, especially after Little Misunderstanding waved every red flag possible. That said, I do think Steve and Faye don't have as strong a following pair. Steve alone writes Talk About Me, another snotty, piss-off track to romance, this time about gossip and fidelity. He brags about his happy, youthful relationship to people who crassly chatter behind his back, but are themselves clearly miserable. A solid track with some actual rhythm and vinegar. I just think it's lacking in hooks and melodies, none of which stand out. It's almost there, it just doesn't go far enough, like a lesser Damage or Straitjacket. This album on the whole lacks in real choruses. The songs have hooks of some kind, but most feel half-written and weak, including this one. On a better album, this track would be filler. Steve and Faye's next track has a different problem, and yet it's the one song anyone seems to like anymore, including Bruce. Sad About Girls. A longing, almost elegant lament about girls leaving boys in the middle of the night. It's one of the times the album hits a real moment of resonance with some genuinely lovely melodies. Unfortunately, I'd say it's Steve's weakest vocals on the album. He sings it too lazy, yet he also tries to decorate his lead melody, but ends up weakening it and throwing it off instead. The music is also thin, with the lead guitar pushed too far back. It overall feels like the demo version of itself.
Escape in the morning. You wanna leave him without even a warning, a trace or a coin card.
It doesn't help that I first heard this track performed by Elvis and the Attractions. During the Trust sessions, they gave this one a go, the only song by one of the Attractions that Elvis recorded during their time together. That cut was included in the Rhino Records reissue, and it sounds so much more complete. Elvis clued into the song's strengths. He focused the vocal melody to its essentials, and he let Steve just go ham on the piano, draping the whole thing in gorgeous melodies that stand among his best on a Costello record.
A trace or calling card. Sad about girls who know perfectly well why he's so sad about this girl. He's so mad about this girl tonight.
It's probably the most damning thing I could say about an Attractions solo album. Sounds like you guys could have used Elvis on this. But the album does close on another surprising highlight. Steve and Faye's lurid Camera, where an erotic relationship is forever preserved in a metaphorical or literal photograph, and therefore forever at the narrator's drooling whims. Like Taste of Poison, going deranged helps give the song some lasting teeth that this album's songs needed. And I'd argue it's one of the album's most complete sounding tracks. A sharp rhythm guitar fills out the mix under Steve's focused driving organ. Not on the level of This Year's Model or Armed Forces, especially since Steve is not a talented singer, but probably the closest the album gets to those, just in sonic tightness. Not my favorite track either, but it does leave the album on a high, even if Sad About Girls would be the more tonally appropriate closer.
Height, almost postcard size. You can be enlarged, see the color of your eyes behind my camera.
Also worth noting, the album released with a bonus solo EP by Steve, Outline of a Hairdo. It's just 4 short piano and synth instrumentals, written as a score for an imaginary film, wherein he flexes his classical training and compositional skills. It's short but beautifully performed and recorded, not a million miles away from Rick Wakeman's The Six Wives of Henry VIII. And I love that album, so I endorse this. Probably the 5 strongest minutes to come out of this mess, as damning as that is to end on, but just from the opening notes of the EP. Yeah, you can tell who's finally playing to his own strengths. So that's Mad About the Wrong Boy. The album didn't chart, the singles didn't chart, and they failed to impress critics. The kindest review I found came from Italian critic Pepe Vedetti for Rockstar magazine, who preferred it over Rockpile's recent, and much better album Seconds of Pleasure. Vedetti still described it in patronizing terms like good time music and backwave, at least according to auto-translation. Few other critics were so warm, considering it inessential upon release. The Attractions continued to back up and record with Elvis through 1987, though with ever-growing interband tensions, especially between him and Bruce Thomas. This includes Elvis recording almost an entire album without them, and then an actual entire album without them after he left F-Beat and signed to Warner Brothers. He intended to regroup with the Attractions for 1991's Mighty Like a Rose, but an apparent lawsuit halted the plan. To make matters worse, in 1990, Bruce released his bitter memoir of touring with the band, The Big Wheel, which, while not directly responsible for the falling out, severely damaged his working relationship with Elvis. However, through a confluence of lucky timings and some healthy intermediary work by co-producer Mitchell Froom, Elvis reunited with the Attractions for 1994's Brutal Youth under apparently good circumstances with everyone. They recorded one more in 1996, All This Useless Beauty, but unfortunately, all the old issues returned, and they fell apart all over again, especially him and Bruce. After its supporting tour, Elvis split from the Attractions for good. Steve Naive and Pete Thomas reformed with Elvis for 2002's When I Was Cruel, but with new bassist Davey Farragher under the moniker of The Imposters. That band remains by Elvis's side to this day, while Bruce seemingly retired from music, but continues to moonlight as an eclectic author. These days, Mad About the Wrong Boy is in obscurity, and not treated much kinder than that, even by the guy who wrote a quarter of it. If any book about Elvis and the Attractions mentions it, and plenty don't, it's only in a paragraph or two, assuming the author even managed 2 lines. Retrospective ratings and reviews tend to place it in the middle of the road, and that's pretty much how I feel too. It's clearly by a band who have no confidence or real stake in the project, except maybe Steve, with consistent problems throughout. Clumsy lyrics, dull vocals, and an unsubstantial yet often overproduced mix. These songs sound like approximations of what a real songwriter would do. And I can make that claim because it's what most of my music was like. I feel a kinship with this album is what I'm saying. As I've detailed throughout this video, it's not without its strengths and surprises. From the times they kick in a gear, to Pete's ever-reliable tight drumming, to Steve's many keyboard textural flourishes, I say around 2/3 of this album is worth a listen entirely on its own merits. Though Little Misunderstanding is the worst song this band ever recorded. I can hear a version of this album and this band without Costello that pulls together more confidence in themselves and makes something worthwhile. Bruce said in a 1987 interview with Guitar Player that their original rehearsals were better, like a more dangerous version of David Bowie's Spiders from Mars, another backing band that released their own album. But they lost all that in the studio trying to please everyone, lending more credence to this being entirely F-Beat's idea. Having only ever heard this version of the album, I can't speak to that, but I will say that multiple of these tracks sound completely different from anything Elvis ever did, in a good way, not just a disposable new wave bubblegum band. The critical consensus that it's only for Elvis completionists is fair. At least get through Punch the Clock first. But maybe save this one as your palate cleanser for Goodbye Cruel World. I unironically like this album more. With some more songwriting practice and a lot more energy, I think they could have evolved into an interesting band in their own right. Even by just their second album if they tried one. And apparently they did, but it was never released, and even Bruce hasn't shared any details on it. There were rumors that a 1982 F-Beat band called Blanket of Secrecy was them in pseudonym, but it was eventually confirmed to be different people, though one of them was Roger Bashirian. I listened to their album, Walls Have Ears, and it's even blander than Mad About the Wrong Boy. And yet, it does sound like a band actually on the same page, putting in the effort, which the Attractions just didn't. Elvis later provided some insight to that incongruity, that strange lack of cohesion, despite the many great, cohesive records the Attractions made with him. Richard Gere interviewed him in 1991 for Cream magazine during his scraggly asshole period, and according to him, none of these 4 people were actually very close. Quote, I think the audience always assumes bands are really tight, particularly at first when there was the illusion that we were a group, as opposed to a songwriter with a group. The group didn't get on only with me, but also with each other. People's tolerance for one another's behavior would change from time to time. When asked how much the Attractions influenced him, he, quote, guffawed, and asserted that the unrecognized factor of their music was, although they are very good musicians, I had quite a lot to do with the arranging of the songs. There were sections written into the songs originally that couldn't couldn't be played any other way. I could get a bunch of bloody college students to play the music and it would sound the same. Do note that all of this is under the shadow of Bruce's book and the apparent lawsuit. Like Bruce's bias against Mad About the Wrong Boy, Elvis is likely biased against Bruce and the Attractions at the time of this interview. But do also note that Elvis is wrong. The 3 albums he recorded around this time without the Attractions, Spike, Mighty Like a Rose, and especially the later released Kojak Variety, all have multiple songs that feel like pale imitations of what the Attractions were capable of. They cry out for the energy and flexibility of Steve, Pete, and Bruce. Benmont Tench, a keyboardist on Steve Naive's level, sounds like a college student playing what he was told to play on Coltrane robberies. Not anything close to Steve's dexterity and melodic sense. Richard Gere notes in this interview the production and compositional flourishes in Mighty Like a Rose that Elvis takes credit for over his backing musicians, and not one track on that album has the life and spark of what he and the Attractions made together on Imperial Bedroom. Nothing like Pete's drums on Beyond Belief, Bruce's bass improvisations on Shabby Doll, or just Steve's piano improvisations on The Loved Ones, to say nothing of everything else Steve contributed. Also to say nothing of the utter limp slog that is Kojak Variety, a useless covers album that's desperate for the Attractions' energy. Pulling back to be level-headed about it, this is very old shit that I'm sure the guys are decades past caring about. I think all of this just highlights the importance of the collaborative process. Elvis and the Attractions made multiple masterpieces in a row before this album, and would make at least 3 more together after it before their dissolution. But not thanks to one individual. Yes, you had a great songwriter who could spit his lyrics like venom and tear your heart to pieces. Yes, you had 3 of the most talented musicians of their day backing him up and elevating his work beyond his own capabilities. And yes, you had the excellent production of Nick Lowe and engineering of Roger Bashirian, and later Jeff Emmerich, John Jacobs, Colin Fairley, all of whom recorded that greatness and further elevated the band's work to its masterpiece status. But they accomplished those great records because of the synergy of all of their talents together. Without Nick Lowe's guiding hand, Bashirian's excellent engineering and production sounds thin and distracting. It loses its body, punch, and purpose. Without the Attractions and/or a good producer, Elvis sounds like a great talent, missing the grit and musicianship to prop up his venom and vulnerability. And without Elvis, the Attractions sound like a talented group of musicians, missing their unifying voice. Thanks again to the Elvis Costello Fan Wiki for their extensive archives, and thanks to the Elvis Costello fan forums for helping to track even more obscure information over the years. It was through them that I found Bruce's comment confirming Tim Renwick's involvement, for example. All of my sources for this video are gathered together in an archived blog post linked below on my Ko-fi, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting me there. This video was brought to you by the support of my Ko-fi patrons.